Vladimir Putin, speaking at a conference in St. Petersburg on Friday, vowed that Russia would meet all of its objectives in what he called Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. Then this morning, both NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson warned that this war may drag on for a long time. I want to dig into what's still to come in this conflict with two of America's most distinguished former military leaders. Admiral James Stavridis was the Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. He is now Vice Chair of Global Affairs at the Carlyle Group and the author of a new book, To Risk It All. General David Petraeus was CENTCOM Commander and Commander of Allied Forces in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He also served as CIA Director. He is now Chair of the KKR Global Institute. Jim, let me start with you and ask you, do you agree we're in this kind of middle phase of the war? And what is its nature? What will, who's going to break out?
We are in a middle phase. It's a good way to describe it, Fareed. And I think it'll depend on the support from the West, most crucially. And by the way, how does this come out? I want to start with three simple words. I don't know. Nobody does. War is the most unpredictable of human activities. But what really is happening here in this middle phase is you've got two burn rates going on, if you will. Vladimir Putin's burn rate is the killed in action, the equipment destroyed, the impact on his home front, the impact of sanctions. That's burning along. And over on the Ukrainian side, it's the patience and the support of the West. So, Fareed, if we do the right thing in terms of additional military support, keeping the sanctions on, keeping the diplomatic pressure, I think the sketch map that you laid out of pushing back to those pre-invasion, current invasion lines is a pretty good place to start thinking about when those two burn rates will bring the two actors to the table to negotiate.
Dave, this is the Russian strategy after Plan A failed. Plan B is a pretty brutal strategy. As far as I can figure it out, it's use a lot of artillery, essentially destroy these towns and cities, and then walk into the ruins and claim conquest. But it does feel like it's working in the sense that very slowly they are gaining ground in parts of the Donbass. Explain to me how you see the battle right now.
Well, this is a grinding, bloody, costly war of attrition right now. And as you point out, it is just artillery, rockets, bombs, missiles, destroying the defenses, especially if they're in a built-up area, as is the case with Severodonetsk, the current focus of their war machine. And they then do essentially walk in and take over the rubble after they have essentially depopulated it of both people and defenders. The question really is whether they can sustain this. Have they put so much into this one area that they can't do much elsewhere? And that would enable the Ukrainians, who are absorbing this enormous quantity of weapons and ammunition and other materiel, building units that can conduct counteroffenses from the southwest toward the city of Kherson, and then pushing south from Kharkiv, the second largest city. And I think in the weeks that lie ahead, we will see which side can generate forces the fastest, whether Russia really can replace the personnel, weapon systems, and ammunition that they're losing, and the same on the Ukrainian side. And I should just note, for some perspective here, that the Russians are losing more in a single day, every single day on average, than we lost all U.S. and coalition forces in the worst month of the surge in Iraq. And the Ukrainian casualties are very high as well.
Dave, can I just ask you to expand on this in the sense that who has the possibility in this stalemate to break out? Who would you put your money on in the sense that can the Ukrainians actually recapture some of those cities like Kherson, or will the Russians perhaps even be able to expand out of them when you look at this balance of forces?
I'd put my money on the Ukrainians. I think they've got tens or thousands, if not over 100,000 of potential soldiers, if you will, that they have recruited, are in the process of training. They're bringing in enormous quantities of weapons from the U.S. and other NATO and Western countries. I mean, 126 155 millimeter. These are heavy artillery pieces alone. 260,000 rounds of 155 millimeter howitzer ammunition. These are staggering quantities. Yes, there should be more. We should give more multiple launch rocket systems, and I think we will. We should provide the Predator drones as quickly as we can, get all of this in there. I think they have the possibility of doing this, having absorbed so much of what the Russians have thrown at them in Severodonetsk and still having not yielded there. So the Russians are impaling themselves on that location, consuming enormous quantities of, again, men and materiel. And I think when that's done, they're going to have to hunker down, and it'll be the turn of the Ukrainians, who are already pushing in the southwest, trying to liberate the city of Kherson, which was really one of the first cities taken by the Russians when they pushed north out of Crimea Peninsula.
Stay with us. When we come back, I'm going to ask Admiral James Stavridis what possibilities there are to make it possible for the Ukrainians to start moving their grain and other goods out of Odessa. Jim Stavridis has a plan to help Ukraine. I'm going to ask him to explain it when we come back. And we are back talking about the war in Ukraine with two of the smartest military leaders I know, retired Admiral James Stavridis and retired General David Petraeus. Jim, as you know, the crucial issue for Ukraine's economy is, can they get their goods into the Black Sea and through that to the world? Right now, essentially, the Russians control the Black Sea. Odessa is impossible to use because the Ukrainians have mined it. The Russians are blockading it. The Ukrainians have mined it to prevent Russians from attacking. What is the way out? You and I have talked about this a lot, and you have some really interesting proposals.
I'll go to sea with you in 1 minute, Fareed, but first I want to simply agree with Dave Petraeus. My money is on the Ukrainians also for another factor besides the heavy material from the West and the burn rate of Vladimir Putin. The other reason is motivation. If you're on the front lines of the Ukrainian war and you're Ukrainian, you look over your shoulder and you see your spouse, your children, your parents, your elders, your civilization, your language. All of that gives great motivation to these troops. Let's go to sea for a minute, because Fareed, it's not just an economic lifeline for Ukraine. This has global impact. If we can't get that grain out, we're looking at remarkable and terrible food scarcity, food security issues, notably in North Africa and the Middle East, already not the most stable regions in the world. If that grain can't get out, we're looking at knock-on effects that are truly terrible. So what do? We have to get the grain out. We begin, I think, by taking a page from history, go back to the 1980s, look at the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, I should say, where the Iranians were trying to block the Strait of Hormuz and bottle up Kuwaiti oil. We, the United States, reflagged those Kuwaiti tankers. We could do something similar here, and then escorted them with U.S. Navy warships in and out. Would have to clear the mines. We have the capability to do that. Many of the mines are Ukrainian anyway. This would be in international waters and Ukrainian waters. I think it is risky but unlikely Putin would take a shot at a U.S. Navy warship escorting grain, humanitarian, through a humanitarian corridor. So that would be a quick sketch of it. A lot of risk, a lot of planning would have to go into it, but we need to do something to get the grain out, not just for Ukraine, but for food globally.
Dave, you also were talking to me about something which I think is worth bringing up, which is we haven't talked a lot about what happens in the areas that Russia controls. Is it possible for the Ukrainians to mount an insurgency? Because as you well know from Iraq and Afghanistan, if they can mount a effective insurgency, that could bog the Russians down in many serious ways.
No, it's a wonderful point, Fareed. And first, let me just agree with my old shipmate, Jim, that the sheer morale, the resourcefulness, the determination, the heart of the Ukrainian forces is extraordinary and has been all along. And that's also what's going to go on in the areas that the Russians have taken control of, where there are still Ukrainian citizens. Those citizens hate the Russians at this point in time. No one has done more to spur Ukrainian nationalism than Vladimir Putin. And they are very, very good at, again, all kinds of resourceful activities behind lines. And you already see this again in that area around Kherson, where they're starting to carry out essentially guerrilla operations and partisan attacks and so forth. And we're still very early on. There's still no real organization of that behind the lines to speak of. So the prospects of that for the Russians have to be pretty daunting, I would think. Because that could really unhinge what they're trying to do behind lines, even as, of course, Vladimir Putin would really like to absorb these areas. He'd like to have a referendum, and they say that they all want to desperately be part of the Russian Federation, and he then graciously brings them in as new republics in the Federation in some fashion. So that is another aspect of this war that I think we will see increasingly, literally in the weeks and months that lie ahead, that has not been a feature of the war so far.
Jim, finally, we have a little bit of time, but I got to ask you, you have this terrific new book out that actually Dave Petraeus blurbs at the back. And it's all about taking risks under pressure. So I want to ask you about the guy we're all interested in, his risk profile, Vladimir Putin. Seemed to be a cautious, calculating, incremental guy, and then went for this, this all-out strategy in Ukraine. What do you think explains that?
Massive miscalculation in a leader who has isolated himself. David and I both know leadership pretty well, and we both know the last thing you want to do as a leader is cut yourself off from input from your juniors, your intelligence officers, your generals who could come to you and tell you honestly what's going wrong. And if you cut yourself off and think of Vladimir Putin sitting at that long gondola-like table with a cluster of his acolytes at the other end, he's isolated himself, and I think that has led to massive miscalculation. And finally, look at the other side of the risk equation here, Zelensky. Here's a Churchillian figure who is the one looking over his shoulder. He is risking it all every day. I salute him.
Well, I salute both of you. I really think this is such an intelligent conversation. I very much hope that the Biden administration is talking to both of you, which I suspect it is. Thanks both. Next on GPS, Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden blame each other for inflation and high gas prices. Who's really to blame? I'll ask that question when we come back.